Your child's a genius. Now what? Anna Hulbert is here to discuss her new book, Off the Charts, The Hidden Lives and Lessons of American Child Prodigies. How do you confront the issue of race and white privilege in a novel about a white kid in Boston? Sam Graham-Felsen will be here to discuss his debut novel, Green. Alexander Alter will give us an update from the literary world. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is Inside the New York Times Book Review. I'm Pamela Paul. Anne Hulbert joins us now. Her new book is called Off the Charts, The Hidden Lives and Lessons of American Child Prodigies, reviewed this week in the Book Review. Anne, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
So your first book was called Raising America, A History of Parenting Advice, which I love. And it was it was a really interesting way to approach a subject because it was about, obviously, the people who give parenting advice, the doctors and the psychologists and the sort of gurus of parenting. But it was also, in its way, a parenting book. And to a certain extent, it seems like this is also, in its way, a parenting book, and that people will glean lessons from it about raising children. But obviously, that's not the intent of the book overall. I'm curious how you got from Raising America to this subject.
Well, in writing Raising America, I was fascinated to learn how much early experience seemed to be a crucial focus of experts for an entire century. They were promising, based on sort of shaky evidence, but with lots of confidence, that early nurture was going to reveal untold new dimensions of human potential. Every generation would be, more enlightened than the next. And one of them, G. Stanley Hall, who you may remember as a turn-of-the-century psychologist, I think even used the word super children. But I ended up finishing that book thinking, I really didn't get a chance to write about children. I wrote about adults. I wrote about the experts.
Well, that's interesting.
And at the time I finished, I was sort of disappointed to feel that. And also, of course, I was writing more about theory than about practice. Experts are always opining about what should work. They're not generally telling you what actually does work. And as I finished that book, I was also at that phase as a parent when my kids were more in the gauntlet of the college focus moment. So I was particularly aware of the realities of this incredible focus on early high achievement for kids. The rugrat race, the overscheduled child, the hurry child, all those phrases were so much in the air. And I thought to myself, I know that we're not the first to be so preoccupied with precocious achievement. And I thought I would love to find out, by looking at actual children, how these hopes and fears about what kids can and can't do early played out over the course of sort of the previous generations, what had changed, what hadn't changed. And prodigies seemed to me there were real children with incredibly interesting, anomalous, and yet sort of symbolic childhoods that had stirred up lots of debate while they were unfolding.
Another similarity between that book and this book is that while, as you say, the distinction is that this is focused really on the kids, is the historical aspect. That was a history book in many ways. And this is too, although you also do talk to and discuss kids who are still around. How did you decide to kind of balance that between, sort of old, famous, in many cases, celebrated child prodigies and kids who are today and maybe less well known?
What my goal was not just to write about kids who can do these amazing things before they lose their baby teeth or hit puberty, but to do that in the context of the social situations they found themselves in and the debates they stirred up. So my choices were sort of dictated by which children ended up being the focus of conversations and fears about social potential and social possibility and social pressures. And I was surprised to find how often that was the case, but how my choices kind of focused in on those particular kids. So some of those obviously have remained well known, like Norbert Wiener, and who is one of the first in the opening chapter, who went on to found the field of cybernetics. His father, along with the father of a fellow Harvard prodigy at the turn of the 20th century, were both stirring up real interest. And I found lots of newspaper articles about the debates. This was exactly the point at which the whole idea of precocity was being debated. Was it really a terrible thing, or were there ways in which whole new horizons could open up if we turned to kids then? So he stood out as a perfect case study. I felt Shirley Temple, who's another very well-known prodigy I write about, she too was this sort of emblematic figure in the Depression for all kinds of reasons that I wanted to explore. And the whole idea of a childhood that was about instilling confidence in parents and showing the great performative capacities of kids became a really national obsession. Articles were written about, you can raise a prodigy just like Shirley. So that was part of choosing her. And then now, of course, prodigies are still out there, not being paraded the way they were. And that was part of the interest in, for example, the last prodigy I read about, a piano prodigy named Mark Yu, whose mother, I think, was both part of, but a response to more recent thinking about how you shouldn't treat children who are amazingly good at something amazingly young. And I wanted to include that perspective in the book, too.
I'm curious if part of it, too, was that you wanted to balance out these historical figures with people who are still alive today and actually get a chance to meet them and talk to them and interact with them.
Yes, absolutely. The 3 chapters about current prodigies, or more recent prodigies, some of them are now grown, so I met them as adults. That's true of the chapter I write about computer prodigies. I'm picked in the context of writing about some of the ones we all know about, Bill Gates and Steve Jobs. I write about 2 who probably most people wouldn't have written about, who were among the first of a group of kids singled out by a talent search, which probably listeners will have heard of, the Johns Hopkins talent search. Before it had actually truly taken off, these were 2 boys who were amazingly good at math, very young, and were sent off to college and ended up becoming among the pioneers in computing. And it was fascinating to talk to them now as adults and have them look back on their experiences, which I very much wanted to do. And they were a very interesting contrast to the West Coast prodigies. They were the Johns Hopkins products of a sort of much more structured idea of how you would train a very advanced mathematical talent. And both of them in their ways rebelled in very interesting ways. And then I also write about autistic savants, and that proved to be very interesting to me, and they caught my interest in part because the widespread attention happened around the same time as this obsessive interest in 10,000 hours of practice as the key to any extraordinary achievement. And of course, the savant notion is the antithesis of that just somehow these talents come out of nowhere.
Right, it gets the whole nurture-nature debate
going. And I ended up writing about a jazz prodigy who I ended up spending quite a lot of time with at the point when he was no longer a child. He was in Manhattan School of Music, so a graduate student. And that was very interesting. And talking to his parents, and you get a very different view when you get to actually see a person who has weathered that and watch him unfold, which I really did get to do, and it's a great story. And then the last chapter is about Mark Yu, as I mentioned before, a piano prodigy who emerged. He is Asian American, and part of my interest in that was the attention at roughly the point when I first met him when he was 6, our sort of obsessive interest in how China was maybe getting ahead of us, and they focused incredibly on early achievement. And Mark was an adorable little kid who was incredibly enthusiastic about not just being a piano prodigy, but at that point he was also studying cello. And I ended up being in touch as he grew up and ended up deciding he really didn't want to do this anymore. That the incredibly arduous work of aiming to be, in the end, a virtuoso who will, have a career was taxing in a way that he decided he wanted no more to do with. And his mother, who was obviously a very central part of the story, listened to him in a way that you will learn from stories preceding this one in the book. Many parents didn't.
Right.
And said, and she herself was, I think, approaching the point where the question of just how much was worth the real turmoil and difficulty of a childhood devoted to arduous practice. They were commuting to Shanghai for piano lessons with a teacher. Listened to him and did everything she could to sort of ease a transition into a life as a ordinary kid who kept playing the piano but was trying to be an ordinary kid.
The idea of having a prodigy is complicated, right? I mean, we don't have a universally positive attitude towards prodigies, even in a day of kind of obsessive competitiveness among parents. The idea is that prodigies are complicated, that it can be torturous, that you constantly hear about the musical prodigies who, throw the cello out the window, or the chess prodigies who then go on to be, confined to a mental institution for the rest of their lives. I'm curious if that attitude has changed over time.
I think that the ambivalence about prodigious accomplishment runs deep and has always been there. I think the part of what interested me was precisely that even as we are fascinated by seeing what children are capable of doing, we're also really on guard for all kinds of reasons.
Yeah, why are we so scared of prodigies?
Well, I think they challenge egalitarian ideas if we believe that they are born. And Americans tend to be a little uneasy about doing that. I think they also can make parents feel that they're inadequate if their kid isn't measuring up, but there is a kid who can measure up. And I think in general, there's a certain schadenfreude that slips in there. Then you kind of want to learn that, well, actually, it didn't pan out so well.
But then there's also the case where parents are sort of frightened and put off by their own children who are prodigies, right?
Yes.
If you are not super educated or intellectual or high achieving.
Right. Well, and it is really intimidating and difficult to respond to a child who is incredibly preoccupied and obsessed with a pursuit of something that goes way beyond your ken as an adult. You're suddenly not the guide. And it is very hard to keep children like that happy and interested and thriving. So it is a huge challenge. And I think the question of where they're headed becomes very fraught, whichever way you are inclined to think, whether you feel there's a possibility they will be unlike anything that the earth has ever seen, or you're worried that burnout is around the corner. Neither of those is a comforting thought, really.
So your children are grown now. You're not sort of dealing with the question of, is my child a child prodigy or not anymore? If you were starting out now, or if you were giving advice or counsel to someone, let's say you're talking to someone, I do think my child is a prodigy. What do I do with this? What do I do about it? What would you advise them?
I think my main piece of advice would be, and this would not be suggesting it's easy. I think the main thing is to tell parents to try to keep clear the difference between your aspirations and your approach to the talent and the child's own drive and curiosity and interest. Because I think one of the things children have that adults don't have so much of is this ability to be simply absorbed in a thing that they are interested in and love to do. And prodigy stories sort of remind you of how short, really, childhood is in the context of a life, and how much as the other things that a child learns in childhood are going to be crucial to whether that talent blossoms. And it's not easy to keep that in mind, but I think it is probably crucial that a child's own sense of autonomy and control and interest in what they do is going to have to be the main motivation if it's going to be a talent that blossoms. And I think that one of the other things I discovered in the course of working on this is the near ubiquity of an adolescent crisis for child prodigies, which I think is also helpful to keep in mind, because what it's usually about is just that suddenly a child has to think to himself or herself, this is my talent. Where did it come from? Why am I pursuing it? Do I want to continue pursuing it? who am I?
Right.
And issues of identity and autonomy are crucial to the development of a person. And they're going to arrive, and equipping your child to face it and deal with it well is, I think, a big challenge one wants to focus on early.
Well, those are two pieces of advice that I think work for all parents, not just parents of prodigies. So hopefully our listeners will heed both. Anne, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Anne Hulbert is the author of Off the Charts, The Hidden Lives and Lessons of American Child Prodigies. Sam Graham-Felsen joins us now from LA, where he is on book tour for his first novel, which is called Green, reviewed this week in the book review by Jonathan Miles. Sam, thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So you have a very nice title now, which is debut novelist, but I think your previous title is even cooler, I have to say, which is chief blogger for Barack Obama's 2008 campaign. Before we talk about the book, I have to talk about that because, I mean, first there's the question of like, what is a chief blogger and what did you do?
Before I went to Obama's campaign, I was a journalist writing for The Nation, and my beat was sort of youth politics, campus politics. And so I was doing a lot of reporting about this guy named Barack Obama who was gaining a lot of traction on college campuses. Eventually, I got to know people on the campaign and kind of got excited enough about the candidate myself that I asked them if they were looking for anyone who knew how to write. And I basically got called to Chicago and didn't even know what my title was until I got there. And my boss said, yeah, you're going to be the blogger for the campaign. I said, the blogger? He said, yeah. So back then it was a pretty small ragtag bunch. I was one of the early people on the campaign. And it kind of grew and grew into this multi-thousand-person giant organization pretty quickly. But yeah, my job was sort of to act as much as I could as kind of a journalist embedded in the campaign, telling the story not just of Barack Obama, but of the kind of grassroots movement that was forming around him. So I traveled around the country, mostly to early states like Iowa, New Hampshire, Nevada, South Carolina. But a lot of what I did was like meeting, people from all different walks of life, farmers, construction workers, veterans, and telling their stories. My inspiration was kind of like the James A.G. Walker Evans kind of collaboration of just getting these snapshots of America at a particular time. So it was a really cool experience.
Also, clearly, you were infusing it with a very literary approach. I have to go back to that title, though. So you were hired, they said you're the blogger, and then, the operation expanded. Did your title go from the blogger to the chief blogger?
Yeah. Yeah.
That was a promotion?
Sort of, yeah. I mean, once we expanded, I was able to hire people to be on my team of bloggers. We had not only a few national bloggers, but we ended up having bloggers in every single state. So, yeah, I sort of ended up overseeing the whole operation. Like I said, I tried as much as I could to infuse it with a literary approach and to be a journalist as much as I could. But, of course, I was pushing the message of the campaign on some level. I was producing, propaganda, but I didn't like to think of it that way, but sure, that's what I was doing.
Well, now, that probably looks like very high-minded because now it's probably like chief tweeter, of the
Sure.
campaign. Did you consider joining the administration after that experience?
I did, and it was a really hard decision not to go to the White House. To be honest, I grew tired of being on message. Mm-hmm. I got kind of antsy, and it was on the campaign that the idea for my novel Green started to bubble up in my mind. And I got frustrated that I couldn't tell the whole truth. I had to say one part of the truth, which was that we had a campaign full of hope and change, but I couldn't, for example, talk about race at all, even though that was the elephant in the room on the campaign.
Was that explicit?
It wasn't explicit, but it was more just like, if I talked about race on the blog, it would have to be, this is a campaign that brings together Black, white, Latino, Asian, Native American. It could never be sort of explicitly like, the exciting thing about this campaign or the most exciting thing is the fact that Obama is Black. That's just something that it was so obvious, but it was also, we didn't want to draw attention to it. There was enough attention already being drawn to it. And particularly when controversies started bubbling up around the church that Obama went to, it was it was just kind of this issue that we tiptoed around. And, that was frustrating to me. I mean, of course, I understood it, but it was frustrating to me as just a curious person and somebody who was not accustomed. I'd never worked in politics before. I was not accustomed to being on message and, having this sort of rigorous discipline. And what attracted me to writing fiction is, wow, here's a space where I can say anything, where I can really have the freedom to go absolutely anywhere and go into this dangerous territory, go into this off-message territory that I could never go into in a political environment. So I knew that if I went to the White House, it would be even 10 times more message discipline than we had on the campaign. And even though there was obviously something intriguing about going and working for the President of the United States, I felt myself pulled in a different direction and ultimately pulled towards writing fiction.
Well, it's interesting, too, because you're constrained, of course, when you're a journalist, as you were writing for The Nation before joining the campaign, in that you have the facts and you have to report them. And you, as much as one might wish, like, wow, I really wish I could have someone who would say X, or if only I could find someone, who was, I don't know, married to a dog or whatever,
totally.
Great thing that you need. You cannot do that in journalism, but you can in fiction. And I'm curious because you said that one of the frustrations you had on a campaign was that you were not able to talk about race explicitly. This is a novel about race. Was that the primary kind of thing that you wanted to get at?
I knew that I wanted to write a novel about race, and particularly a novel that was inspired or sort of loosely drawn from my own personal experiences going to a public school in Boston and being one of the only white kids in my entire school. And so I knew that I had this kind of personal material that I had long kind of wanted to play with in a fictional realm. And well, actually, I should back up. I started thinking, maybe I would write a memoir. I had no experience. I had zero experience writing fiction, and really had no idea how to create plot or create characters or anything. So
you were not one of those people who grew up thinking, I want to be a novelist when I grow up. You were a writer.
I really did not think that I would become a novelist. I wasn't a big reader as a kid either. Now I love reading, but as a kid it was, mostly reading the sports page and things like that. Mm-hmm. And so yeah, this was becoming a fiction writer was something of an early midlife crisis for me, I think. I kind of became a fiction writer in some respects out of a process of elimination. I tried all these different things. I tried journalism. I tried politics. I tried all of these different spaces where I could use the power of language, and all of them felt unsatisfying to me. And finally, I came upon fiction. I said, this is it. Once I started writing fiction, something instantly clicked in me, and I realized, this is actually what I want to do for the rest of my life. I'm getting this freedom to explore ideas and explore the possibilities of language without having, as you said, without having to be tied down by the inconvenient things like facts or political message discipline or anything like that.
All right, let's start by giving a little bit of background about what the book is about without going too much into the plot. Tell us about your two main characters and also why you chose to set it in 1992.
The narrator of the book is a kid named Dave Greenfeld. He's a sixth grader. He's one of three white kids at his public school, but he says he might as well be the white kid because he has blonde curly hair and blue eyes and really sort of dorky clothes, and he just sticks out immediately on the first day of school. He has a hard time initially. He gets bullied and, called white boy and made fun of for all of the reasons that you might imagine he gets made fun of, including using the word awesome on the first day of school, which he quickly discovers is not the right word for cool.
Not awesome.
Correct. Not an awesome word. And it's funny because the word awesome, I think, has been reclaimed as a cool word now. So Dave would be okay now, but the book is set in 1992. So Dave eventually befriends a sort of nerdy but confident classmate named Marlon Wellings, who's a black kid who happens to live in the public housing project right around the corner from Dave's house, on Dave's block, actually. And they bond over a funny thing. They bond over the fact that they both like Larry Bird. And for those who are listening who are not big basketball fans who aren't from Boston, Larry Bird is a legend. He's one of the great basketball players of all time, but he's white. He was very slow. He couldn't jump very well. He was sort of gawky and awkward. And when I was growing up in Boston, it was not cool to root for Larry Bird. In fact, if somebody called you Larry Bird on the basketball court, it was not considered a compliment. For kids like me, it was considered a diss or an insult. So the fact that Marlon openly likes Larry Bird and Dave secretly, in his heart of hearts, loves Larry Bird kind of quickly gets them connected, and they quickly forge a bond over their love of the Celtics. But it's really the fact that Marlon is an unconventional, pretty unself-conscious kid who flouts the social conventions of the school, whereas Dave is a highly self-conscious kid who desperately wants to conform to the social conventions of the school. And that kind of funny mishmash gives them this electricity, and they connect very quickly and develop a powerful friendship. So that's what the novel is about. It's about the rise and eventual fall of their friendship. It's set in 1992. The more I looked into that year, the more it felt like this seminal year for the country. And it was the year that Bill Clinton was elected president. And of course, Toni Morrison famously called him the first black president. He was going on Arsenio Hall playing saxophone and really speaking to a lot of people, including African Americans, in his style and approach. It was also a heavily racialized election like the one we had just now, where Bill Clinton was throwing hip-hop artists under the bus, including Sister Soulja. So he was simultaneously courting the black vote, but also courting the white working class vote by insulting hip-hop stars. Meanwhile, but the big event of 1992 was the Los Angeles riots. And I remember as a kid, this felt huge for me because until the riots, race relations had been kind of this simmering thing throughout at least my childhood. It felt that way. It felt like, yes, there was tension, but it was sort of under the surface. And then all of a sudden, this city exploded and there were fires and it was all over the news. And we were watching people getting beaten from helicopter cameras. And that came at a time where racial tensions were starting to bubble up across the country and really explode across the country. And then, of course, a year or so later, there was the whole OJ sensation. It just felt like the early 90s were this time in which race was at the forefront of the American conversation, much in the way it is today. I mean, I feel like there's a lot of eerie similarities between 1992 and 2018, 2017. So it just felt like this really fruitful time period to look at. There aren't that many novels yet that are set in the 90s, and it just felt like new, interesting territory for fiction.
You went from being in a situation where, as you mentioned earlier, it was difficult, if not verboten, at least sort of there was very limited way in which you could discuss race, to a situation where there are no limits on what you could say or write about race or address and the ways in which you could address it so that you're not obligated to cover strictly the facts. Was that scary?
Very scary because, look, I am a white person. I'm a man. As a white man, I'm very aware that there are too many white men who sort of bloviate about race and write about the black experience and sometimes even tell black people how they feel or how they should be feeling. And I was very, very conscious that I did not want to come close to doing that in this book. I didn't want to generalize about race. And I know that when speaking or writing about race in a not careful or not thoughtful way, often more harm than good can be done. So I was very careful in the revision process.
Mm-hmm.
In the early drafts, I just had to let it rip. And I just went there and I said, I know this is a sensitive topic, and I know that I could get in some heat for even going there and writing about this. But as a fiction writer, my obligation is just to try to tell the best truth that I can and not be afraid and risk humiliation and just go there. But in the revision process, I did two things. One, I just deepened the characters a lot more. So every character, I hope, in the book feels pretty human and multifaceted. So even if there's a character who may seem to have traces of something that might give a hint of stereotype in one aspect of their personality, they also have about 16 other aspects of their personality that undermine that stereotype or complicate that stereotype. So that's one thing I did. But the other thing I did, I just sort of carefully weeded out that felt kind of half-baked or lazy, or just a joke that was just a joke or just a gag and didn't say anything deeper about my theme, which was race and segregation in America. And I just wanted to make sure that, every line in the book is something that I can stand behind and something that I thought long and hard about why it needed to be in the book. It just felt very important to me that if I'm going to write about race, especially as a white guy, I want every line to count, and I want to be able to justify why I put every single line in the book. Any wasted breath on race, I think, especially, again, coming from a white guy, can cause more harm than good.
Well, it's not only a book about race, it's a coming-of-age novel. It's a book about Boston in the 90s. It's a book about friendship, and in particular, interracial friendship. And we've managed to talk about it without revealing, I don't think, a single plot point. So we will allow readers to discover those on their own. Sam, thank you so much.
Thank you, Pamela. I really enjoyed this. Thanks.
Sam Graham-Felsen has his first novel out now. It is called Green. Alexandra Alter joins us now with news from the literary world. Two different versions on the end of the world.
Exactly. Yes.
Hi, Alexandra.
The literary world is still very much interested in politics and dystopian fiction, which seem to converge more and more these days. So there has been some interesting updates on Michael Wolff's book, Fire and Fury, which is continuing to sell like crazy. They have sold foreign rights in 35 countries, I believe. And he has signed on for another book with Henry Holt. His publisher announced at a book party for him this week. So he'll be doing something else for them.
We don't know what.
They did not say what it would be. No, I don't know.
They're not going to let him in the White House again, I don't think.
But there were, as you would imagine, some reporters at this book party for him. So some of the comments were reported on. Steve Rubin, who is the publisher of Holt, was praising Wolff for, quote, taking on the planet's biggest bully. So they're clearly enjoying this back and forth that they've had with the White House. It's certainly helped their sales.
Trump has tweeted about the book 5 times now.
Which is remarkable. It's certainly, been a huge boon for them. So the sales figures just came in from NPD Bookscan for the first week, and it sold just under 192,000 hardcover copies. And the ebook sales were apparently over 250,000 units, which is really quite high for ebooks, particularly these days when that's not as strong of a category.
Well, that probably had a lot to do with the fact that the hardcover was not widely available.
That's what I was thinking. Yeah, I think people who couldn't wait to read it decided, I'll just download it. I'm not going to wait for it to come into bookstores. And the audio sales have also been very strong. They sold more than 100,000 copies of the audiobook.
There's still a wait for it on Amazon, right? Like beyond the normal, you can't kind of get an overnight delivery of it?
Yeah, on Amazon it says for the hardcover, it usually ships between 2 to 4 weeks, which for the same-day delivery company is obviously an enormous lag time. So we're seeing the demand continue for this book.
There were also a lot of pirated copies going around, which I thought was interesting too. And then some people on social media getting sort of very vocal about how, like, look, no matter what you think of Trump, no matter what you think of the author Michael Wolff, this is piracy, it's theft, and it doesn't help publishers or the book world, and it's illegal to pirate, copies of it and pass them around.
Yeah, it's not typical for, a book about politics to be in such high demand that piracy becomes a problem. I mean, you see that more with, a Game of Thrones screenplay or something.
Right. And apparently, I guess, in Korea, North Korea, they're reading a pirated copy.
Yes, they've gotten hold of it somehow. The other big news to come out of the Fire and Fury book this week was that, of course, it's inevitably going to be made into a TV show. On Wednesday, The Hollywood Reporter broke the news that Endeavor Content is going to be developing it into a TV series. And the speculation started immediately on social media about who would be cast in various roles. So that should be interesting.
Well, there's some more TV book convergence going on the fiction side.
That's right. We're seeing a number of additional dystopian novels being adapted for TV this year. The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood was so successful in its first season. It's coming back for a second season in April. And there's also going to be adaptations coming of Philip Roth's novel, The Plot Against America.
That was broken in the New York Times Book Review.
Yes, the New York Times Book Review broke this major news out of Hollywood, which I was very excited to see. So that is being adapted by David Simon, of course known for The Wire, and it's going to be a 6-part miniseries. And after the New York Times Book Review broke that news, David Simon confirmed it with other outlets. It will be interesting to see his take on the novel, which is, of course, an alternative history, but it's a sort of somewhat dystopian flavored one. It depicts an alternate America in which Charles Lindbergh defeats Franklin Roosevelt in the 1940 presidential election, and he was a Nazi sympathizer. And some people have tried to draw parallels to our current state of politics, but Philip Roth has been, very clear that he doesn't see them as completely overlapping. He made that point in his excellent interview with Charles McGrath, which everyone should read. I was going to suggest that we should reenact it actually on the podcast, and I could play Charles McGrath and you could be Philip Roth.
We're selling the TV rights to it, Alexandra, so you're going to have to try out.
Another dystopian adaptation that I'm looking forward to is Fahrenheit 451, which was, of course, Ray Bradbury's novel, which was published in 1953. And it presents this future America where books are outlawed and burned. And so that is being adapted by HBO. And the trailer is already out. So we're going to be seeing many, many more dystopian-themed novels adapted onto television.
Well, I'm looking forward to the end of the world then.
I'm looking forward to watching it on TV.
Okay, good. Thanks, Alexandra.
Thanks for having me.
We have something really exciting to tell you about here coming up, which is a new book club, Now Read This. It's a collaboration between us here at the New York Times and the PBS NewsHour. And what will happen is there is a Facebook page, you can go online and find it, called the Now Read This Book Club. Every month we're going to be picking a new book, and readers can submit questions for the author and learn more about the book and the author online. At the end of every month, there'll be an interview on air on the PBS NewsHour with the author, and it will include many of your questions. So this is really a participatory book club, and we're super excited to announce the first author on the book club and the first book choice, which is Jesmyn Ward's Sing Unburied Sing. I think many of our listeners here and readers of the New York Times Book Review will be familiar with this book. Of course, it was one of our 10 best books of 2017, and it won the National Book Award. And just a few more things about Jesmyn Ward. I won't go into the book too much because hopefully you will discover it yourselves. But Jesmyn is kind of an amazing figure. She is the first woman to win the National Book Award twice for fiction. Her second novel, Salvage the Bones, won the National Book Award in 2011. And Jesmyn does not only write fiction, she also edited a great anthology, The Fire Next Time, that came out in 2016. And then that was an anthology of essays about race. And she has also written a memoir, very moving memoir, called Men We Reaped, about the death of her brother and 4 other young African-American men in Mississippi. She's just kind of a force and really writes about her community. She's from Delisle, Mississippi, which is a small rural town. She's the first person in her family to go to college. She went on to go to Stanford. She was a Wallace Stegner Fellow, just 1,000,001 accomplishments, and she still lives down in Mississippi. And so we're very excited to have this novel, Sing Unburied Sing, as our first featured book and look forward to having many of you participate. So again, you can find it on Facebook. It's called the Now Read This Book Club. And our first pick is, once again, Jesmyn Ward's Sing Unburied Sing. Joining us now to talk about what we're reading this week, my colleagues John Williams, Barry Guin, and Lauren Christensen. Hi there.
Hey, Pamela.
Hello.
All right, let's start with John. You've got a New York Review of Books book.
I've got a New York Review of Books
you.
book. They have that elegant, consistent look to them. This is a novel by a writer named, I sympathize with this writer being named John Williams because her name is Elizabeth Taylor. And
Right.
It's not that Elizabeth Taylor.
Right, and you have like 2, at least, John Williamses that you're not.
There are about 60, but what's funny is that everybody only mentions the composer. He has sort of triumphed over all the other famous John Williams. She's a British novelist who NYRB has put out several books of her work. This one is from, I believe, 1957. It's called Angel. And it's the first one of hers I've read, and I'm really loving it. It's about a young woman. She's really just a girl when we first meet her, a teenager, who has this very vibrant, fantastical imagination. And she lives in this kind of drab apartment over the grocery store that her parents own. But she imagines that she lives in this palatial estate. And so she eventually writes this novel about such an estate. And she becomes a really famous writer, but of these kind of bad books. And so it's very funny about the pretensions of art and the sort of monstrous egos of writers, even when they're not that good. And she becomes rich, and it kind of tracks her life. There's a coworker here who read it a few years ago and said that she found it a little too cruel, because you do sort of laugh at this person's expense a lot, but I just think it's very witty.
But you
and
like
sharp.
doing that, John.
I do.
All the
I do.
time.
I don't mind a little cruelty in my literature. So it has an introduction by Hilary Mantel. I think it'll be the first of many books that I read by Taylor.
And when was this reissued?
2006. So I think in the last 10 to 12 years, they've reissued 4 or 5 of her books, including a short story collection. So there's plenty more to go.
All right, going from mid-20th century to very of the moment. Barry, you are reading the book that is on our bestseller list at number 1 for the second week in a row.
Well, I share my interest with thousands, if not millions, of my fellow citizens. Fire and Fury by Michael Wolff, I think, is a how to put it, a gripping read. I'm surprised at the vigor of his writing style. I think that carries the book to a large degree, and I'm pleased that he's been able to write as well as he has. But I think the real reason for my interest in the book, maybe the book's success, is that Michael Wolff seems to me to be the perfect journalist to cover the Trump administration. It's almost you set a thief to catch a thief. Trump, as we know, is utterly cynical. He believes that everything is a matter of power and will. He is able to spot people's weaknesses because he really has no values or ideas of his own except his own success and personality. And I think of Michael Wolff as basically the same way. So he's able to spot people's weaknesses. He's able to describe politics as a matter of power and power relations. I think one of the best moments in the book is when he's describing the triangular relationship between Reince Priebus, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and Jared Kushner and Steve Bannon. And it's not about principle and it's not about ideas. It's purely about will and who is going to triumph over the other two.
It's a team of rivals, right? But
a team of rivals without the concept of team.
Right.
And the historian that I think of is Suetonius, describing the peccadilloes of all those Roman emperors. And Michael Wolff is, forgive the inflated comment, but there's, I think, some truth to it, is our Suetonius. He loves to grovel in the dirt. That's all he sees. Now, for people who think that politics is more than that, who think that politics is a matter of policymaking, decisions, cost-benefit analysis, well, that's true. But in the Trump era, if you believe that, you come off sounding sort of prissy and wonkish. And if you believe that politics is a matter of value and principle, you come off as sounding stiff-necked. What you need is an utterly cynical reporter who sees the world exactly as Donald Trump does and then can produce that world for you.
what's interesting is that the Trump books that have come out thus far, and there have been a few of them already, kind of go into two groups, right? They're one of those groups can then be further divided. But they're the books that are about Trump, and you can divide that into the people who love him and the people who hate him and sort of what he's done and what they think of what he's done, whether they are fusing over it or despairing. And there's those books, the sort of more thinky, wonky books, as you've said, and not even necessarily wonky, but just kind of, in a way, emoting books. And then there are the reported books, the ones who are up close and interacting with Trump and his circle. And Wolff's book clearly falls into that. And the other book that I think fell most closely into that is Katie Tour's book about being on the campaign trail with him. And those two books, I think, are also the two books that are selling or have sold the best.
Well, I think that's right in terms of sales. What I'd say about the difference between those two is Tour was always the outsider. and the object of Trump's attacks. One of the great mysteries of Michael Wolff's book, and it's been commented on, is how did he get this access?
Right.
Alone. How did he alone get this access?
Well, didn't he give them some kind of other title that he said it was going to be, like Triumph of the, there was some kind of exalted...
It doesn't matter. He has a reputation. And even if he doesn't have a reputation, you don't want a reporter sitting in day after day conducting, he says, 200 interviews, many repeated interviews. How did this happen? And the only analogy I can think of, and I was talking about Suetonius, now I'll talk about one of the early muckraking reporters, Ida Tarbell. Mm-hmm. The way she did her history of Standard Oil was that she went into the offices, she sat there, she observed, she took notes, I assume she took notes, and no one paid any attention to her. She was a woman, she was sort of recessive, and Michael Wolff seems to be not only the Suetonius of our time, but the Ida Tarbell of our time.
Are you going to watch the TV show when it gets made?
I think we're living through it. I don't know.
Right, exactly. We don't need to watch this. We're seeing the TV show right
Exactly.
now. Lauren, you're also reading something very contemporary.
I am, yes. I actually had just finished Fire and Fury and switched over to something.
Well, let's hear your review of Fire and Fury.
Well, Barry and I were talking about it. I mean, I think we disagree a little bit on the merits of Wolff's writing style, I thought. While I read it, I didn't plan to read it fully through. It just kind of happened. I picked it up and simply could not put it down. And it was, I consumed it the way I have to compare it to just, watching sort of reality television on Bravo, that I'm not proud of it. I don't really want to, other people to know how voraciously I'm into this, but I couldn't resist it. And I think it sort of appealed, his writing style. Yes, there is a skill in this, but I think it appeals to some base instincts that we have as readers. And, like the reviewer, I felt it deeply unsatisfying at the same time that I just couldn't stop reading it. Just all of the listed theories for why certain really fundamental moments unfolded the way they did just left unresolved.
Like a potato chip book.
Exactly. Yes.
All right. But now you're reading something better.
Yes. So to turn to fiction, I picked up, I have to confess that when I first received the galley of The Perfect Nanny by Leila Slimani, I didn't think much of it. The cover is, it appears quite commercial. There's just this, a photo. There's a headless woman with sort of Peter Pan collar, blue, apron or dress, and it seemed like sort of a run-of-the-mill, women's thriller. And I thought, maybe later, but I didn't attend to it. And then I read the New Yorker profile on Leila Slimani, and then I was...
The Lauren Collins's profile.
Yes, and I was completely captivated. So I picked it up and was thoroughly surprised throughout the entire book at how... Obviously, it's going to have major commercial appeal, but it is a deeply literary and psychological portrayal of the relationship between a mother and the help that she hires to care for her children when she makes the difficult decision to go back to a career. So it's about a young couple in Paris that's a mother of two, and she's feeling very deeply dissatisfied with her life as a mother and decides to go back to become a lawyer. And has to hire help, and she finds this miracle nanny who, just runs the house seamlessly. Dinners are cooked, gourmet meals are cooked. The children are behaving better, and she seems to have a real affection for the kids and a real knack for sort of bringing out the best in them and taking care of them. The spoiler is in the first sentence, and everyone knows the nanny ends up murdering one of the children, and that is the first line of the book. And so the remainder of the 200 or something pages is really, as I said, a psychological portrait of the woman who has the children and yet would prefer to spend her days at her office and her career versus the woman who has abandoned her own life, her own family, and her past to care for someone else's children, and the mindsets and the complexities that go into those two identities. And I think my favorite part about this book that was so twisted and creepy, but absolutely captivating.
You're not going to reveal anything, are you here?
No.
Good.
But it's just the sense that the lines of sympathy are not as clear-cut as you would think. And I will say that I think that the nanny is a much more three-dimensional character even though she's obviously the villain, her character is developed with much more complexity and real intrigue, I think, than these rather more flat characters of the husband and wife. And then there's, racial politics, which is also very fascinating. It's a French-Moroccan woman who only wants to hire a white nanny to take care of her children, and just, things like that are just bring in a full
So
portrait.
for those who have not read the book and didn't read Lauren Collins's profile of Slimani in The New Yorker, I think the most interesting things about this to prospective readers is one, the Prix Goncourt, which is France's most prestigious literary award, but that two, it was based on a true story that happened here in New York, in which a nanny killed, I think, 2 children on the Upper West Side. That was just this terrifying murder. Anyone basically who has had a child in the last 50 years or lives in the metropolitan area has sort of been gripped by that. It was just so distressing. So that's on my list too. But I have to finish first the book that I'm reading, which is Walter Isaacson's biography of Benjamin Franklin, An American Life. And you can't see this, listeners, but my copy is really bedraggled because it fell into the bathtub. I'm very glad that it was not a Kindle. So it's still readable. It's still operable, but it doesn't look pretty at all. And almost for that reason alone, I want to be finished with it because it's really unwieldy. It's metastasized to twice its normal bulk, given the water exposure. And I'm almost done with it. But it's sort of part of an ongoing project I feel like I have, which is to overcome the way that the Revolutionary War period and the colonial period, but especially the Revolutionary War, was taught in public elementary school that I went to here in New York, which is essentially this. In 1776, we signed the Declaration of Independence, and then we were our own country. So it was like a combination of that and Schoolhouse Rock that taught me this very, very simple timeline that I've subsequently tried to overcome. I've read Gordon Wood's, History of the American Revolution. I read Ron Chernow's Hamilton, and I'm reading this. And yet nothing seems to ultimately knock out that very bare bones, basic and erroneous version of
simple stories are very powerful.
Yes. I go back to the song, No More Kings.
Yeah, I won't hear anything bad said about Schoolhouse Rock.
No, I have nothing bad to say about Schoolhouse Rock. But the other interesting thing I'll say, without going too much into particulars of this book, since I haven't finished it, is this last weekend I saw Hamilton for the second time, the musical. I took my youngest child to see it, and this picks up on an earlier theme, I think now maybe we're 2 years ago that we talked about this on the podcast of seeing musicals based on books. So there was a period in which I was reading Les Miserables and also then Hamilton sort of in short succession and seeing the musicals both before and after. This was my first time seeing the musical after I'd read Ron Chernow's biography. And it is, it is worthwhile if you can get, cheapish tickets to see Hamilton again after reading that biography. It's worth it to see because it's just such, like Les Miserables, it's such a feat of adaptation, of just figuring out what are the essential parts of this story. And to me, the most interesting part of Chernow's book was the first 70 pages when Hamilton is young and in the Caribbean, and the historical record is the most sporadic on that front, and yet it's totally fascinating. To me, the idea that you could sort of island hop in the Caribbean, escaping debts, divorces, deaths, and just kind of really, as the musical goes, start a new life in a new city and then flee to New York where, in New York you can be a new man. And that is all crystallized in the first 3 lines of the first song of Hamilton. So it's very impressive. I'll talk more about Ben next week.
Have you seen the musical 1776?
I have not yet seen 1776.
It shows every July 4th.
Why? What do you have to tell us about 1776?
Well, I'm mixed about it. It drags in bits, but I think for what they're trying to do, they do succeed. And I really admire the cast. I think the fellow who played Ben Franklin was perfect for the caricature that they're creating. Obviously, Franklin is more than that. In fact, I'd like to get on to, the biography you're reading. A few years
You don't want my bath-worn book.
I actually have my own copy. A few years ago, I was reading a group of Ben Franklin biographies. I'm from Philadelphia, so I have a certain immediate sympathy for him. He's my favorite founding father.
Well, he's like everyone's favorite founding father.
I mean, he's the one who's most modern. Mm-hmm. I mean, he's so witty and smart and manipulative and scheming and lusty and creative. And he was a superstar, and he deserved to be a superstar.
Well, it's interesting because Isaacson opens his biography with, I think, the line that, Benjamin Franklin is the founding father who winks at us. He's
That's
the one
right.
we can relate to. And I find it very interesting to read this. I have not read any other biographies of Benjamin Franklin, but I've read his autobiography. And so, of course, right there, you see the vast differences between the way he depicted his own life and his early life and the reality of who Benjamin Franklin was. And I am not from Philadelphia, but I love going down there, and I love going to the Franklin Institute, again, where you get a kind of Schoolhouse Rock version of who Ben Franklin was without sort of learning the seedier or senior.
Well, when you read the autobiography, at least, if you're of a certain age, it's hard to read it without also thinking of the D.H. Lawrence attack on it. And of course, Franklin, what
was the D.H. Lawrence attack on it?
Well, he just... What I'd recreate is out of my own head, possibly not what Lawrence said, which is that he is this inauthentic, false, over-striving, dry individual. And of course, what's so wonderful about Franklin, which you get, and the autobiography was written for public consumption. It's really a little kid's book. It's the equivalent of George Washington, I Cannot Tell a Lie, whereas the actual Franklin is just great. And fun to read about and fun to spend time with, and not at all what he presented publicly.
He did not follow his own advice. We can say that much.
Okay. Yes.
All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Pam.
Thank you.
He even has the nerve to tax our cup of tea.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books, and you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. Inside the New York Times Book Review is produced by Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.
They wanted no more Mothering England. They knew the time had come for them to take command. It's very clear you're being unfair, King, no matter